Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 64 of the Ask Historians podcast. So today we're continuing our, this is part 2 of the conversation we started 2 weeks ago, speaking with David Fowler about milling and baking in the 19th century and seeing that all the parts of society that something as basic as bread can touch upon. Today we're going to start talking about things like branding and marketing and commercialism, but also we're going to be talking about kind of the industrialization of the process with, large factories springing up and particularly large factories for milling, not so much with baking as we'll see. We'll see that it kind of is a small, baking stays small and kind of dirty. We'll talk about some of the health codes and things that came about as this process, adulteration of goods, the role of the Lancet in bringing about some of these changes. And then finally, we'll kind of end by talking about how the idea of these changes in British diet, and particularly, British diet relates to this milling and baking of, this white British national loaf, relates to the changes that are happening in Britain in terms of it being, imperial nation as it becomes the empire upon which the sun never sets. But before we get to that, I know what you're all really here for, which is it is the first episode of the month, and therefore it is time for the Ask Historians book giveaway. So again, if you are a supporter of us on our Patreon, which is patreon.com/AskHistorians, you can get entered into this. Just for $1, you get one quote-unquote ticket. For $5 gets you 2 tickets, and $10 gets you 3 tickets. And so this is, and you can also, apparently some of you have marked that you want to donate without any gift. So I haven't included you in this. If that is not what you wanted, feel free to go back and switch that over, or just let me know and I can make a notation for later. But in the meantime, drawn randomly from our list of supporters, we are actually, you know what, let's not do that. Let's tell you the books that we're giving away first. So we have a choice. You get to pick one of these. So we have our panel of flares on Ask Historians have suggested well over 100 books at this point. And you can, again, if you want to, if you're listening out there, you can feel free to go ahead and suggest those as well. If you have some more things that you want to add to the list. But we have, I pick out 4 books. I randomly select 4 books. Well, randomly select 3 books, and then I pick one that I like because I'm the host and I get to do that. And then our winner gets to pick one of them. So the selection that we have for our winner of the raffle this month is Jeffrey Parker's Global Crisis, War, Climate Change, and Catastrophe in the 17th Century. That comes to us from panelist Lubiak. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. We have Eugene Rogan's The Arabs, A History, and that comes from panelist Captain Buck. We have Mary Beard's SPQR, which is recommended both by Valkeen and the Fairy Guinea Pig. These names. If you've never listened, if you're not familiar with Ask Historians subreddit, these names will seem ridiculous. And finally, my pick is Elizabeth Finn's Encounters at the Heart of the World, A History of the Mandan People. And that was recommended by Reed Stilt, but is the 400 Rabbits choice of this month. So those are the 4 books of which our winner may choose one. And drumroll. That's kind of a shitty drum roll, I'm sorry. But our winner is Matthew Suozo, whose name I probably just mangled, but hopefully you'll recognize it. You're kind of unique in the fact that you have a bunch of Z's in your name. It's great. So I hope you enjoyed that. And so, Matthew, I'll be getting in touch with you via the email that you have in the Patreon account that you are donating to us. So thanks you so much for your support, and I hope you enjoy whichever book you pick out. I'll be shipping it to your home after we kind of get in contact. With that out of the way, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
So we have this, national loaf, I guess you could say, and this growth of nationalism. But I mean, really at the same time, we also see changes in the class system in Britain, I guess you could say as well. This kind of growth of the middle class and industrialization, creating this kind of, less of what we think of kind of lords and peasants in a way. But I mean, do we see the millers and the bakers at this time? Because we've been talking about they've formed trade journals. They're building it sounds like factories, at least small scale. Do you see millers and bakers becoming this kind of urban professional class?
That's an interesting question. There's a guy named Harold Perkin who's written a book, sort of a classic of English social history, called I'm going to forget the title. The Rise of Professional Society. about England after 1880, but it's really about how the country comes to be ruled by a class of experts, sort of technocrats, who might not necessarily be the people in the Houses of Parliament, but they are the people who administer the country and run things at a sort of grassroots level. And I think that we can say that millers definitely become kind of like this. They become a set of professionals. Professionals is not the right word. Millers definitely become a kind of group of, shall we say, better trained tradesmen. They are certainly what we would consider a working class, but a kind of technical working class, a skilled working class, who are literate, who build these trade journals, who write textbooks, who begin to explicitly adopt scientific language to help them do their jobs. And like one way I can illustrate this. So if we go back to that guy John White that I mentioned earlier, the guy who wrote in the 1920s or 1820s.
He of the grow potatoes by your feet.
Yes. And to be honest, I don't remember exactly what he said. So I hope it was grow potatoes by your field. Pretty sure it was something like that.
If someone's following our advice to grow grain in the 19th century,
then they should look it up themselves. Yeah. So what he would say, though, is that a true baker would not need anything other than his hands to sort of do his job. So he will talk in the 1820s, he'll write about how some bakers in those days were beginning to use thermometers. And in his mind, that was pretty weak stuff, that a real baker, a proper baker in his mind, would be able to know how hot an oven was just by putting his hand into it and just sort of feeling it. And there's a real sort of tactile quality to their expertise. And you see bakers as time goes, or bakers and millers as well, as time goes by, will begin to adopt much more explicit scientific language. So they'll begin to do things like run chemical tests on the grains that they're using. They will begin to categorize grains much more clearly. They'll begin to start reading the growing nutritional literature, the literature that nutritional scientists are coming up with, to figure out, like, is bread healthy? Spoiler, they will conclude that it always is healthy and is in fact the best thing for you to eat.
Particularly if it's British grown.
Oh yes, definitely. Or Canadian, because it's imperial. We'll come to that in a moment. But so to compare John White, who basically said don't use a thermometer, you can look at guys in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, when they're creating these trade journals, these technical institutions to actually train bakers. They'll have a set of examinations, and they'll publish the examinations in the trade journals so that people can practice. And they'll have the answers written out and everything. And these examinations will be questions that reflect the global reach of Britain's food supply. So they'll say things like, you need to make a white flour, and you have at your disposal some high quality Russian summer wheat. You have a whole bunch of Minnesota spring number 2 and some poor quality English wheat. How would you mix these things? How would you grind them? What proportions? How do you do this? How do you produce a consistent white flour from them? And then what's really interesting is the prizes for these things will be things like microscopes. Now, I don't think there are too many millers and bakers who are genuinely using a microscope in the mill or the bakery, but the symbolism of it is very powerful. To go from a guy, say 70 or 80 years before, who said don't use thermometers, to, hey, a true professional miller would be a scientific man who'd have a microscope handy if he wanted one.
Yeah, well, this kind of connects it into larger, I guess you could say, scientific revolutions going on at this time, because we talked previously about how a lot of this was taking place in the context of the Industrial Revolution. But I mean, at the same time that we're talking here in the late 19th century, we're talking kind of the golden age of microbiology. Enormous advances in essentially biology, microbiology, chemistry as well. And I think maybe the one part that we haven't talked about in terms of bread making is that we've talked a lot about wheat, but I mean, it needs yeast as well, right? Do we have yeast entering the picture, at least in kind of how we would understand it to be used?
So the traditional way that bakers would do it is that they would use brewer's yeast. Brewing, English people drink beer. they would buy from whoever was brewing beer nearby. And if we go back to the 17th century, that's basically every household. It would be a 17th century English housewife's duty, part of her sort of domestic tasks, to brew beer. So there's a constant supply of yeast available. So they'll use yeast. What we see, though, is that brewer's yeast can vary in quality. Sometimes you can get good quality. Sometimes it's very bad. And if it's bad quality, you risk either the yeast in there not being strong enough so that it doesn't make the dough rise enough, or being too strong, in which the fermentation sort of progresses too much, and you go from a kind of sweet, yeasty flavor that would make the bread rise to a sour flavor. And if you recall, English consumers do not like sour bread. Scottish consumers are fine with sour bread, but English consumers don't want sour bread. They want sweet bread.
Yeah, when we say sour bread, are we talking something like, our traditional San Francisco sourdough kind of thing like that?
I think so. Now, I have to confess that although I study bread a lot and I read a lot of things about bread, I don't actually bake myself. So I cannot claim to be an expert on feeding sourdough starters. I have some inkling of what people in the 19th century did, but I don't do it myself. But if we look at what sour bread means and what yeast is in Scotland, they develop barms that is pretty much growing their own sourdough starters. So they will combine water and flour and maybe some other things. So sometimes hops, sometimes wormwood, which I believe both of those have some kind of antimicrobial properties, which I suppose for these bakers would encourage certain kinds of microbes, but encourage others and lead to the strains of yeast that they like. So these Scottish bakers will basically grow their own yeast and do it that way. English bakers will buy yeast. But what we start to see, so one part of industrialization is not merely mechanization or the application of fossil fuels, although it definitely is that, but it's also a more specialized economy, an economy that is simply significantly larger, that has access to greater energy supplies through fossil fuels, that can pursue tasks, can pursue things on an industrial scale that simply were not done before. So one example of this is the development of industrial yeast. So in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, you start to see companies that are doing things like manufacturing alcohol for industrial purposes. So not booze to drink, but alcohol for use as a solvent or as an ingredient in some other thing, to use with dyeing, to use with all kinds of other industrial processes. And these guys pretty quickly figure out that they can manufacture a lot of yeast. They can manufacture pure strains of yeast. They do figure out there's a set of breweries in Burton-on-Trent, which is a well-known brewing center in England, that develop pure strains of yeast. And they begin to manufacture huge amounts. And so British bakers begin to buy this compressed yeast, which they use to get very highly risen loaves.
So, I mean, you mentioned that we have essentially this kind of growth of, I don't know, I wouldn't even call it connected industries, but almost kind of parallel industries that are kind of growing up around these changes in milling and baking. But when we're talking about companies that are making this and companies that are doing that, I mean, what kind of size of companies are we talking about? Are we seeing like, the Walmart of 19th century British milling coming up, or are we talking like this is still mostly done by people, family companies or something like that? Even though I guess technically Walmart's a family company, so maybe a bad example, but the mom and pops first, Big Mama and Big Papa.
Yeah, I would say that firms definitely get larger. So one thing we see is that, especially in milling and then also in things like yeast manufacturing, the size of the firm gets significantly larger. So mills that you might find in the 18th century would be relatively small, not massive capital investments. Although millers do begin increasingly to act as merchants and sort of brokers for both wheat and flour. They get substantially bigger though. So we start to see industrial mills that are, so you go from a mill that might have a small steam engine or, wind power or water power in, say, the year 1800, By 1900, we have massive mills. So like a great example is the Vernon Mill in Liverpool. It's actually in Birkenhead, which is across the Mersey River.
Someone in that neighborhood almost got very angry with you.
Yeah, right. Not cool. This was a massive mill. It was explicitly designed to accommodate the largest ships of the day, which at that time were quite large steamships. They had to fill in a small stream in the area with concrete to make a foundation large enough for this mill. And then they put in engines that were, if I recall, are basically the size of marine engines. So they had these huge, like 3 or 4 really large, heavy-duty engines. The amount of capital invested in this mill compared to, say, a windmill from 100 years earlier would be orders of magnitude larger. At the same time, though, we don't see the development of anything like Walmart. We don't see like massive firms that take over distribution throughout the country or anything like that. It's still, by the standards of the late 20th century or the early 21st century, it's still pretty small, relatively mom and pop in that sense. Well, I was going to say one industry that stays very small is baking. And the great majority of bakeries are a master baker, a few journeymen or apprentices, and they do they'll do maybe 10 sacks of flour a week, with an average batch being 1 sack. Maybe they'll do 2 sacks some days. So these are small concerns. And in the 1860s, there's actually a bit of a sort of a public food and sort of sanitation crisis when Londoners and medical professionals figure out that, in fact, most of the metropolis's bread is baked in cellars, in these underground bakeries that are pretty terrible from all descriptions of them. And bakers work incredibly long hours. They do mechanize things like mixing, but we really don't see things like bread factories until well into the 20th century, until like 1920s, 1930s, or even later.
You've kind of presaged, 2 of the questions I was just about to ask, and the first of those, which I think you've pretty much just answered there, was I was going to ask if we see something like a vertical integration. So, do we have, even if it's not these huge companies and corporations, do we see someone who has a milling factory who might have bakeries that they own, or they might have a brewery that they own, and then they use the brewer's yeast that they get from there to use in their mill, and then they use that in the bakery, et cetera, et cetera. Do we have that vertical integration?
I've seen a kind of cross-pollination of scientific experts who might work in the brewing industry, who would also lend their expertise by publishing books for sale to bakers. So that definitely exists. I've never come across an example of a brewery that was engaged in baking or milling, or vice versa. What we do see is, going back to the 18th century, there are millers who begin to vertically integrate in a way. So if you recall that whole moral economy, the idea was that the distance between the producer and consumer should be as narrow as possible, right? And anyone who steps in between is morally suspect. Now, that led to regulations that covered bakers pretty intensively with the assize of bread. Millers kind of slipped through the cracks there. There's never really a comprehensive set of regulations that say what millers can and can't do. So that whole moral economy and that older version of the food production and distribution system, actually it's undermined as millers begin to act as sort of capitalists themselves. They begin to speculate in grain. They begin to buy grain wherever it's cheapest, and they'll mill it into flour. And they are capitalized enough that they can then set up bakers in local cities to do nothing but consume their flour. So you'll have a miller that will be a combination of flour merchant, miller, and bakery owner, with several different bakers, in debt to him in some way, working in nearby cities. And let me tell you, bakers hate this. They are not fans of this arrangement and will do their best to avoid it. It's hard to tell how common it is. I definitely see lots of mentions of it up through the 1840s, but not so much after that. That might be just a case of the sources, though, because by the time you get to the 1850s and 60s, the state is investigating baking. So there's a lot of like parliamentary reports on baking, and the technical literature emerges. And so my research really focuses on those sources because they're abundant, they're rich, they're easy to find. Whereas actual descriptions of baking from bakers themselves can be harder to come by. So I really don't know how that changes in the second half of the 19th century.
Well, I mean, in one sense, I mean, could one idea of why, you know, we don't see bakers so much under kind of the vertical integration being owned by millers, is that possibly bakers themselves got bigger? Because this is kind of leading to my second question, is that, you know, when we're talking about these large, it sounds like a very modern factory mill. And then we talk about, contrast that with kind of like these basement bakeries, which may be filthy and dirty. You know, do we see perhaps, you know, bakeries moving into that way as well, into kind of being more, you know, large, you know, factory conditions as opposed to household conditions?
Not that much. Surprisingly little. The milling industry is far better capitalized and far bigger in scale than the baking industry is, definitely until World War I, probably even until World War II. And I can give a couple of examples to illustrate this, or one explanation and then one example. So an explanation is that it comes down to transportation. See, bread is a perishable thing. You know, people very frequently want to buy freshly baked bread. For a lot of the poorest working families, whose diets in the late 19th century are pretty much bread and tea and not much else. For a lot of these people, a warm cup of tea and a warm loaf of bread are about as good as it's going to get for them. I mean, these are families that might not even have enough to pay for coal to heat the house. So they want new bread. And bread itself often won't even sell after more than a day or two. So bakers need to be able to sell their product quickly. They really are not doing anything to sort of preserve the product as it is now. And remember that bread has to be sold in 4-pound loaves, and that remains the law through this whole period. And when you pull a loaf of bread out of the oven, it's going to slowly dry out over time. So its weight is going to slowly fall. The trick for bakers is to make their loaves just big enough that when they come out of the oven, they're a bit over 4 pounds. And when they are sold later that day or the next morning, say, then they're right at 4 pounds. And then after that, they're going to be under 4 pounds. And if anything is under 4 pounds, then the baker has to make up the weight, usually by just cutting a slice off of another loaf, you know, for that purpose, to put on the scale to make it exactly 4. Nobody wants those extra slices. The people buying them don't want the loaves that come with the extra slices. The bakers don't want to waste a loaf doing that. So they want to dispose of their product as quickly as possible. And in this world of the late 19th century, the industrial cities, while they do get very large, they're still very decentralized in retail terms. The great majority of people are still getting their food from the shop around the corner. There really aren't good distribution systems in place for a centralized bakery to produce a large amount of product and get it out to stores, get it out to retail outlets in a timely manner. So it seems, and this is true even up through someone like Maud Pember Reeves. She was like a social reformer who toured around London, the poor parts of London, from 1909 to 1913. And she says, I'll just read a short passage from her. She says, without doubt, the chief article of diet in this budget, so her book is called Round About £1 a Week, which is the wage of a very poor worker. So she says, without doubt, the chief article of diet in a 20-shilling budget is bread. A long way after bread comes potatoes, meat, and fish. Bread is bought from one of the abundance of bakers in the neighborhood, and is not, as a rule, very different in price and quality from bread in every part of London. So there seems to be a kind of homogeneity of these small bakeries all over the metropolis, all over all of the big industrial cities, producing more or less the same kind of bread at a small scale. Now, an example of how we actually don't see vertical integration where we might see it is the company Hovis. So any of our British listeners will be familiar with Hovis bread. It's a special brand of bread that is marketed as especially healthy. Hovis starts as a milling company in Macclesfield, fairly small, and the owner of the company figures out that he can take the germ from wheat berries that's often discarded by millers because it'll make the flour brown, but that has a lot of nutritious elements in it, a lot of vitamins. They don't have the word vitamin until 1912, but there's this idea that there are these mineral salts in this part of the wheat and that these are good for you. So this one miller figures out that he can get this germ from wheat and he can sort of toast it. And it has kind of a nice, pleasant flavor. He can then mix it in with other flour, and he can create this special patent flour for Hovis bread. Now, this is a thing where you'd think like, okay, this guy needs to start marketing this bread. He needs to have like bread factories that will distribute it. That's not what he does, because bread is perishable, but flour is relatively stable. So he manufactures flours. This company will manufacture flour, and they will distribute it to bakers around the country who will bake it on contract. And they'll get these tins that have Hovis on the side so that they'll bake their special Hovis loaves in the Hovis tin. So the loaf will come out saying Hovis on the side, and they can sell it, at a marked up price. So you could see integration there, but he chooses not to. And I think that's because you simply can't distribute it over large areas as well as you'd want to. This does lead to an interesting phenomenon, though, which is that bakers will get their hands on Hovis tins, but not Hovis flour. So they will bake brown bread and call it Hovis. So you get these bakers. Yeah, it's terrific. So you get these bakers who will get their hands on Hovis tins, but not Hovis flour. They will bake brown bread in these tins and market it as Hovis and sell it at a marked up price. But obviously Hovis is not seeing any of this. So Hovis will actually pay people to go around and test bakers' bread and try to determine if it is genuinely Hovis. And they will take bakers to court repeatedly for this kind of thing. And the best part of all is that they will make bakers publish apologies in bakers' journals. So you'll find circa 1900 or so, right around then, you'll see in any baking journal, there'll be a little section that'll have advertisements, and it will have parts that say, John Smith, baker on the high road in Bristol City, confesses that he is guilty of selling non-Hovis bread in Hovis tins. And there's this kind of public shaming in these baking journals that is remarkable.
So it's a bit of a return to the moral economy that we talked about as well. This brings me to another question that I wanted to ask, because I was thinking more about this in terms of, factory cleanliness versus, cellar cleanliness when we were talking about that kind of dichotomy. But, we touched briefly on the idea of adulteration of flour, we were talking about when it was still being, shipped over from the Baltics as opposed to coming in from all over the world. But what do we have in terms of, I guess, if not outright counterfeiting of this specialty bread, but what do we have in place of looking at adulterants into milling and in baking as well? Because again, we have people who are getting microscopes as prizes, so I would expect that we have a bit more of a kind of a scientific approach to making sure that if someone says that they're selling, bread that's made from, Russian hard summer wheat or whatever, that it actually is made, with something that could resemble, Russian hard summer wheat and is not sawdust.
So adulteration is a constant problem. Now, exactly when it begins is hard to tell. Certainly there are complaints of adulteration in the 1820s. If you want to go even further back, there are definitely complaints as early as at least the 1750s. It's hard to know how common, though. What does happen is that with the rapid growth of cities in the early 19th century, and with the removal of the assize, they take the assize away so that bread is no longer tied to the price of wheat, and there's sort of a free market in bread. What they hoped would happen is that the baking industry would become more capitalized. People would bake on larger scales and, would sort of lower the price of bread through economy and capital investment. What we get is actually the opposite. We get a lower price of bread through labor exploitation. So you get journeyman bakers and apprentice bakers who are forced to work longer and longer hours and work harder and harder because there's an abundance of bakers in these industrial cities, and they're all trying to sell at the lowest price possible. So you have what are called undersellers, people who sell under the assize price. Now, the assize price doesn't legally exist anymore, but there's still a kind of price that is agreed that would be sort of the assize price if it were there. And so you've got undersellers that sell under that, and then below them you even have cutters, people who undercut even the undersellers. And the only way that you can really do this is through adulteration. The preferred adulterant is alum. Now, alum is a bleaching agent. And as far as I can tell, it was used in like 99% of bread in Britain, certainly in the 19th century, from at least the turn of the 19th century until the 1870s or so. Literally, you'll read any document about baking, anything that walks through the process of baking. If it's written by an actual baker, it will have alum in it, even though it's illegal. People will describe like recipes for household, for like home baked bread, and they won't have alum in it, but every baker is doing it. And the Lancet, the famous medical journal, in the 1840s and 50s, the medical profession of England is not exactly well looked upon. They are not yet considered the kind of benevolent, friendly neighborhood doctors today employed by the National Health Service in England, in Britain. They're trying to sort of build a role in society. They want to take a role in society that will give them authority, that will allow them to be guardians of public health and to make money for themselves. They're business people as well. So one thing they hit on is that they can start testing food, and they begin to test food for adulterants. And there's a big set of articles in the Lancet in the early 1850s where they test everything. They test candy, they test beer, milk, bread, everything they can get their hands on. It turns out that everything is adulterated in some way. So if you time travel, do not eat the food. There's lead in the candy, there's arsenic in the candy, they're like rubbing copper on meat to make it turn red so that it can't, so they can sell it as though it's fresh. It is awful. And literally 100% of the bread is adulterated with alum. Every single sample they test. So what appeared to be happening is that the poorer bakers were using low quality flour, some kind of brown flour, and adulterating it with alum. And that would allow them to sell it as white bread in the cities. And it turns out that even what are called the full-priced bakers were probably using it as well, because it does seem to make the dough handle a little easier. It makes the loaves separate more easily. So especially if you're going to pack all these loaves into an oven and you're not using tins, there's a big danger that they'll stick to each other and then they'll break. And then you've got broken loaves of bread and no one's going to buy that. So alum helps in that you can sort of separate the loaves more easily. So everybody uses it. They don't use very much. So in a 280 pound sack of flour, that's the standard size, they'll use something like 2 or 3 ounces of alum mixed in with their salt. So it's really a pretty tiny bit that's getting into everyone's loaf. And the bakers eat the bread themselves, so they don't necessarily think that they're doing anything that wrong. But it's there. It's an adulterant that is ubiquitous. And when the Lancet exposes this, when the public finds out about this, they are shocked and appalled. It's both dishonest and there's fears of ill health. So you start to see the development of a medical profession that will actually inspect bread and, by extension, to inspect bakeries. What they'll find is that the bakeries are significantly worse than a bit of alum in the bread. In the early 1860s, the journeyman bakers of London, basically their union, comes together and sends a complaint to Parliament and says, our hours are too long, our work conditions are terrible, we're all sick, this is awful, come and look at our industry and regulate it. And this is the height of liberal Britain. So the dominant ideology of this time is that the state should do as little as possible. That the state really does not want to intervene. They understand market relationships and commerce to be the most natural ways for human beings to interact. And so in their mind, the state is necessarily an intrusion. They do recognize that there are things, though, that the state must do, especially to safeguard the public health. So they begin to send inspectors around to London bakeries, and it turns out that virtually every bakery was in the basement of a house, and the conditions are appalling. There's no ventilation. The bakers themselves will often sleep on top of the table that they use to actually mix the dough. There are toilets and sort of privies within the bakery itself. They find cases in which people are sort of urinating into a privy right next to the sacks of flour. They find that the atmosphere inside these bakeries is absolutely horrifying. They're full of bugs. They'll talk about how there's black beetles or cockroaches crawling over everything. They find worms. They find spiders. They find that what the bakers will do is they'll work really hard, and it'll be really hot in there with the oven, and so they'll sweat, and the sweat will drip into the dough. And they find this absolutely nauseating. I mean, you can read the nauseating. You can see them turning pale as they write this.
So, I mean, it sounds like what you're saying is that when the flour leaves the mill, it's already, doctored up with alum to make it,
Sorry, I forgot. I should have mentioned that. In fact, one thing that these Lancet studies find, we know who to blame. One thing these Lancet studies find is that millers aren't doing it. They'll test the flour and they find that it's not adulterated. They'll actually inspect mills and find that they don't keep alum there. But when they inspect the bakers, everyone does it. So it's clearly the bakers that are responsible for this.
So the flour is leaving the mill, correctly labeled and made at least, hygienically for the time. But by the time it gets to bakers and is made, it's like 90% alum, rat droppings, cockroaches, blood, sweat, tears, and urine.
It's pretty bad. Yeah, it's pretty disgusting. One thing we should note about, so you mentioned hygiene in mills. I mean, we should note how it is that millers actually go about cleaning their wheat. Now, I mentioned earlier that the different varieties of wheat are highly variable, right? So Russian wheat has to be treated very differently from Indian wheat, which has to be treated differently from American wheat, and so on. Well, one of the biggest problems with both Russian and Indian wheat is that it's dirty, as in there's a lot of dirt in it. There's even some allegations that Indian cultivators are shoveling dirt and mud and stones into their wheat to bring the weight up, so that they can, to basically increase the size of their crop by mixing dirt with it. And this drives British millers absolutely bananas. They hate this. The Indian cultivators are probably doing it, though, because merchants in Calcutta and Bombay are not willing to pay them very good prices. So if they're not going to get very good prices for high quality wheat, they might as well get low prices for lots of low quality wheat, right? So go ahead. So put mud in it. Like, why not? The millers will also develop. So one of the other things that'll show up in wheat is bits of metal. So you'll get little bits of wire from like bales. So they come up with machines that, like magnetic separators, they're called, which will go through and pull out bits of metal. And very frequently, British millers are convinced that farmers around the world are deliberately putting things into their wheat, maybe just to mess with millers. Like, I've seen one miller say that he found a quarter of a red brick in a sack of wheat. Another said he found cigarette butts. They'll find these pieces of metal. But the clincher for them, the way that they know that this stuff is put in deliberately, is that they find all this sort of, objects of human existence, but they never find coins. They're convinced that if they found coins, that would mean that it was accident, right? That no one would do that on purpose. But since they don't find coins, these Russian or Indian farmers must be doing it deliberately. So part of the whole milling process is to clean the wheat, is to literally scrub it. They have scrubbing machines that do it, and to wash it and get all the dirt and stuff out. So I guess it is relatively clean when it does leave the mill. And then when it gets into the bakeries themselves cannot be described as anything but filthy. And they are definitely being adulterated. Now, the benefit of a global wheat supply of higher quality, harder flours with roller mills that can be milled into whiter flour is that you no longer need to adulterate bread to get white bread. So we see two things happen in the second half of the 19th century. One is that there's definitely state surveillance on bread. You will have inspectors. So an act in 1860 makes it legal for local governments to inspect bread. An act in 1875 makes it compulsory for them to do it. So the 1861 just said you can do it if you want to, but nobody was willing to pay for it. By 1875, you have the state saying, right, everyone needs to inspect bread periodically, and you need to inspect bakeries. And the bakeries have to have, a certain number of windows. Privies have to be outside. They have to separate the sleeping area from the working area. Real basic workplace regulations like that. At the same time that's happening, the actual flour that's being produced by British millers gets whiter and whiter. So as a combination of surveillance and the fact that it's unnecessary, we actually see the amount of adulteration in British bread disappear. By, I believe it's 1890 or 1892, something like that, there's a government report, a parliamentary report that comes out to sort of look at this issue, and they conclude that while there are some fraudulent adulterations in some foods, and people will still water down milk, for example, bread is pure. They conclude that by that point, their combination of the free market and state intervention and surveillance had created pure bread.
Well, this seems like as good as time as any to kind of move us towards a close. And I guess my final question would be, before we move into a bit of an epilogue, where I want to talk a little bit about imperialism and its role here, but my final actual question about strictly bread things, I guess you could say, is that really, when do we see what we would call modern bread? And it really also, I guess, really kind of underpinning that is like, when do we see modern flour? Because I can go to the store right now and pick up a bag of all-purpose flour, or I can go and pick up a pre-sliced thing of Wonder Bread, which I know Wonder Bread comes a great deal later. But, when do we see, bread that we would look at and say, aha, this is something we would not find out of place either in, flour in our supermarket or, bread in our supermarket?
Well, so there's a couple of answers to this. Classic historians answer, it depends, right? We definitely see the development of white bread as truly ubiquitous in the late 19th century. Now, in the moral economy of the medieval and early modern world, remember that the rules governing food acted as sumptuary laws as well. So the wealthy would eat whiter bread, the poor would eat some kind of brownish bread, maybe adulterated to look white, but it would have been brown. And certainly in the countryside, it would have been brown or even made with barley or something else. By the late 19th century, though, by the end of the 19th century, white bread is pretty much everywhere. And it's very interesting because as soon as that happens, we see a switch. We see a kind of switching of the cultural meaning invested in bread by consumers. In that, once white bread becomes the obvious standard for everyone, many middle-class and upper-class people switch to brown bread. And Hovis is an example of this. Hovis is sold almost exclusively to middle and upper-class consumers. Working-class consumers do not buy Hovis. But Hovis is really one example of others. Like there's a company called the Aerated Bread Company, which, to return to an earlier question, was an attempt to make a kind of mass-produced factory kind of bread. They found a way to leaven without yeast using machinery, but it never really became that popular, and it was always consumed by just a relatively small group of middle-class people. In fact, you can see in one of the documents I read just the other day, which is a report on prisons from the 1860s, right as this switch is happening, there's a physician looking at prison dietaries, and he's trying to figure out what is the appropriate food to feed to prisoners, both in penitentiaries, but also in workhouses, which are places where you go if you are too poor to make money. So if you're too poor to live in this world, then your last resort is the workhouse, where you'll be given some kind of menial task and you'll get a bare minimum diet. Now, they don't actually know that much about what the bulk of the population eats. So they need to try to figure out, what is the right diet? And they're very afraid that if they give you too much in the workhouse or in the prison, then people will just enter the workhouse or prison on purpose to get this free ride, right? So they need the diets in these places to be less than the standard of the working population around them. The problem, though, is some significant chunk of that working population is essentially starving. So they're really trying to walk a line, trying to figure out like how much food can we give them, like what's the minimum we can really give them and not have people like get sick and die. And people do. Like there are cases of scurvy in Millbank prison in the 1820s, for example. So sometimes they err on the wrong side of that line. But in the 1860s, they're trying to figure out what is the thing that people eat. And this physician goes around and looks, and he finds that basically everyone eats white bread at that point. And he's got this wonderful line where he says, brown bread now sells at fancy prices. So that in the old days, you'd have these, very fancy loaves of bread that only the rich would consume. Now there are whole wheat loaves that sell for that. So that this inversion of the traditional hierarchy of color in bread and social class has occurred. And that's kind of the world we have today. Because if you're eating Wonder Bread, you're probably not a CEO, right? At the same time,
it's a mayonnaise sandwich made with Wonder Bread.
Yeah, right. Mayonnaise and bologna, right? At the same time, if you are eating, a whole grain focaccia, you are probably going to get that at Whole Foods, right? So when you say modern bread, that's one way to define modern bread right there. Another way would be to say, to consider some of the preservatives and additives and other processes that go into bread. So bread in the late 19th century in Britain is still quite basic. It's still water, flour, yeast, and salt for the most part, and alum sometimes. They developed techniques for bleaching in the 1890s, early 1900s. And then in the 1930s and 40s, after they have discovered or invented the category of micronutrient, of vitamins and minerals, then we start to see companies deliberately adding those things to flour. So if you, in the United States, or I believe the same is true in Britain, if you go and just buy a bag of all-purpose flour, it's going to have various vitamins and minerals added to it, and that's enriched. So if you buy enriched flour, or if you look on the ingredients of your Wonder Bread, it'll say enriched flour. That's later. That's decades after the period we've been talking about here.
Yeah, but we basically, I guess, from what I'm hearing you is that while our kind of modern style of flour and bread comes, decades later, it kind of has its roots at the time we're talking about.
Absolutely. As everything in history does, right?
Yeah. Well, to really actually close this out on an epilogue, I want to talk about something that it's kind of been in the background of what we've been talking about. And that is, we've said that this happened, as industrialization was happening in the background, as we had this, the growth of the medical profession and the golden age of microbiology. But this time, this is also, the height of the British Imperial system, and when we're talking about, wheat shipped in from Canada, or, very specifically wheat shipped in from India, that's very much in an imperial system as well, where Britain is sitting on top of this massive, political economy over the globe. And I just want to ask, how much does kind of standardization of this, white bread, this strong white bread for strong white people play into the ideas of imperial Britain and how they saw themselves?
Well, there's a couple of ways to approach that. One, I think it's important to note that the global wheat ecology that emerges in the second half of the 19th century is a phenomenon that cuts across the British Empire. If we were to look at the biggest sources for British wheat from 1846 to 1914, the United States would be first. So America really is feeding Britain more than anything else. Second place is often Russia, so another non-imperial source. Third place would be India, which typically is a pretty important supplier. Now, those three will fluctuate. So there might be a bad crop in America. That means they're going to buy more from Russia, vice versa. As time goes on, we see other imperial and non-imperial sources. So Argentina becomes a significant supplier for a period. Canadian sort of wheat fields are opened up, and Australia becomes a pretty important supplier as well. An important thing that emerges from this, and that basically millers and merchants are the only ones that really recognize at the time, is that Britain really becomes dependent on overseas trade, not only for its prosperity, not only for its commerce, as they were, say, in the 18th century, but for their very survival. They absolutely rely on global sources of wheat. Their daily bread is grown everywhere but Britain. Remember that by 1914, they're only growing a fifth or less of what they consume. So this naturally raises defense concerns. And we see a guy named Arthur Crooks in 1898 who sort of does this big speech and really raises a big stink by pointing out that, hey, you know what, there's a limited supply of wheat out there, and we are consuming a lot of it, and world population is growing, so we're going to run into trouble. Especially, he says, if there's a war. And there's like a European war, and, if someone were to, build a big fleet of submarines and attack all those ships that are going across the ocean to bring us our food, then we could be in real trouble. And that's exactly what happens in both world wars. So in World War I, the British are really not prepared for this at all. And David Lloyd George says after the war that the closest they came to losing was when their food supplies got their lowest in 1916, 1917. World War II, they're much better prepared, and you see very intensive state interventions to pretty much compel every farmer in Britain to grow as much food as he possibly can for the duration of the war. So their rationing and their food production is far more effective. But this is... Oh.
I guess what I was driving at, not that I wouldn't want to hear more about this, but I guess what I was kind of driving at is the fact that, there seems to be this kind of scientific mastery of wheat that occurs in Britain. And I was wondering how that played into kind of this idea of Britain as kind of not just technologically superior, but Britain seeing themselves as morally superior. And then they can point to their amazing bread as proof. We have this, we eat the best food that we have made with our rationality and our intellect, and this rational bread feeds into our moral fiber as a nation.
Yeah, so this is all happening right alongside the development of nutritional science. And there's a really big moment in the history of nutrition in 1840 when Justus von Liebig publishes his book Animal Chemistry. And he's the first one to really give a kind of mathematical and chemical basis to nutrition. And he identified foods based on the amount of nitrogen and the amount of carbon and the amount of oxygen in them. His ideas were pretty quickly proven wrong, and proven wrong in a wide range of ways by successive generations of nutritional scientists. But the interesting thing about nutritional scientists through this whole period is that no matter what ideas they come up with, and these ideas can be diametrically opposed, they, interestingly enough, reach the same conclusion that wheaten bread is the best food. And it is, in their minds, the best food for the best people. They see it as the thing that is the definition of food. It is the most basic thing, and that should form the foundation of anyone's diet. And they'll actually go around the world and sort of try to categorize the people that they meet, the people that they encounter in their imperial adventures, to try to figure out what foods these people eat and how this helps explain the power hierarchies of the 19th century. And at that point, what they essentially conclude is that everyone else eats food that's wrong. They look at rice and say, it doesn't have enough nitrogen in it. It's clearly not good enough to maintain really robust people. They will say the same thing about maize, about like Indian corn as they call it, which they'll say as well is it's just not suitable. Even when they decide that non-wheat diets are acceptable, they will still point to wheaten bread and say that it's best because you assimilate or you digest more of it than in other things. How do they know this? Well, the primary way in which you study nutrition in the 19th century is to weigh what goes in, weigh and analyze what goes in, and weigh and analyze whatever comes out. So there's a whole lot of poop weighing. People have to poop in scales, and they got to see and figure out how much nitrogen is in this poop, And one of the interesting conclusions that they reach from that is that white bread must be way better than brown bread because you poop less.
Which, I mean, I guess from a modern scientific nutritional standpoint, that is absolutely wrong. But yeah.
I mean, so my understanding of the modern nutritional science is basically this, that it's probably better to poop more often. That it's, fiber is good for you, that we probably lack fiber with our diet of refined starches. That is sugar, refined sugar, wheat, and meat, which is most of what our diets are today. At the same time, though, the micronutrients and fiber in brown bread is important. But if you have a diverse diet, like if you eat salad and a range of other fresh foods each day, then you can probably eat white bread and you'll be okay. Where the problem really arises is for people who are going to eat nothing but bread, like working class people in the 19th century, then white bread is going to leave you short on nutrients. And we do see this. We do see that populations of working class people who volunteer for military service, say in 1898 with the Boer War, again in 1914 for World War I, they are significantly smaller than their middle and upper class colleagues.
So in a way, there's this weird paradox where at the same time you have these imperial bent of nutritionists going around saying that, wheaten bread is the best food you could possibly eat. At the same time, you see people who are subsisting entirely almost on wheaten bread who are malnourished.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, the contradictions of modernity are right there.
Well, David, I think we're going to have to bring it to a conclusion at this point. Although I do get the feeling that if I let you talk, you would keep going until essentially there's no more wheat left on the planet. But I'll
take that as a compliment.
It certainly is. And I want to thank you so much for being on the Ask Historians podcast.
Well, it was a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
And as always, thank you all for listening, and big special thanks to our Patreon supporters. I hope you're enjoying the second round of the Ask Historians book giveaway. It's quite a lot of fun to kind of go through and be like, oh, what will come up next? So hopefully, now that we're doing this, because of your generous support, we're doing this every month. And so thank you. And thanks to our Flared users as well, who have suggested so many wonderful, wonderful texts. Now that we've listened all the way through both these episodes, I hope you can see why I was so excited about this seemingly very, very dull topic, in the sense that, first of all, David is terrific speaker. He's wonderful to listen to. Although he does, if anyone is familiar with physicist Brian Greene, who speaks a lot about string theory, once you hear their two voices next to each other, you cannot unhear how similar they are. And there were a couple times when I was editing through this episode where I was fully convinced that we were going to stop talking about wheat gluten and start talking about vibrating springs and quantum mechanics. It was a little unnerving, but then maybe I should take more breaks from editing. That might be the problem. But I hope you can see how fascinating this topic was, in the sense that you have something as very basic as bread, and it ends up touching so many different little topics throughout history. And when you focus in on this one kind of very changing time, this transition from kind of medieval society into modern industrial society, you can see how it tracks along with those changes in society, as well as kind of in some ways kind of outpaces them as well. And it's this the bread shapes the man and the man shapes the bread, to get completely nonsensically about it. But I hope you enjoyed the episode. I'd love to have David back to focus in on maybe one aspect of something we talked about, or something, or whatever happened to be tickling his fancy at the time. So he was a wonderful guest. So big thanks to him, and big thanks again to you all for listening. Coming up in 2 weeks, we'll be talking to Jime Dorje, whose name I am probably mispronouncing, because that's apparently what I do these days, is mispronounce people's names. So we'll be talking to him about Tibetan Buddhism, and more importantly, really talking about the formation of the state of what is now called Bhutan. Bhutan? Apparently, as I learned during our episode with them, they don't call it that either, so I don't feel so bad about mispronouncing that. So we'll be talking about that small country and its pivotal kind of the pivotal time when it when it got its foundation, came about to the modern country we know of it today. So we'll talk about that and gross national happiness a little bit in the end, and I hope to see you all then. Until then, feel free to rate and review us on iTunes. We're on Google Play now. Both of those links are in the discussion post. If you have any questions for David or towards me, if you have questions for David about this topic of the podcast, put them up in the discussion post and he'll get right to them. If you have questions for me about the podcast or anything kind of more logistically related to it, feel free to put them up in there as well, and I'll respond back to you. In the meantime, we'll see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/AskHistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you wanted to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.